China has ended its zero-COVID policy, and the world is closely watching the reawakening of this economy and the consequences and benefits it could have for the world in terms of production, inflation, and growth, as the country seeks to leave behind one of the most difficult years for its economy and get back on track with the accelerated growth that has characterized it in recent years. But will it be able to do it? After almost 3 years of strict control to prevent the spread of COVID, the Chinese government has finally caved and has terminated its measures against this virus to move to an approach where they will allow its expansion, considering that the current variants in the country are just as dangerous as the flu, and the fact that a vaccination rate of over 90% has been achieved according to the World Health Organization, thus ending a complex episode that triggered hundreds of protests around the country in 2022. Given the drastic measures imposed by the government on its citizens, while the rest of the world had left the pandemic behind for more than a year, generating speculation about the effectiveness of local vaccines and the reasons behind these strict measures. But zero COVID has not been free and has left a complex economic outlook that has motivated the government to promote a great economic revival that is not limited only to a reopening, but also to a change in the attitude of the government towards foreign policy and private sector. At the diplomatic level, with a change of tone represented by the departure of Zhao Lijian from the Information Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Zhao, who had always been associated with the new Chinese diplomatic current known as Wolf Warrior, had always been characterized by his anti-Western rhetoric and his radical and nationalist approach. In addition, the government has sought closer ties with the European Union and even with the United States, with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Vice Premier Liu He having planned a meeting in Davos at the World Economic Forum this week. Perhaps partying like it's 2030, diplomatic tensions can be eased. And at the level of the private sector, with the end of the 3 red lines, a policy that the Chinese government used to limit the leverage of real estate developers, and that resulted in the current crisis of the sector in the country. But what is happening specifically with their economy that is generating these pressures? Although obviously not everything is bad, there are some data that could cause concern for Xi Jinping and lead to this change of position. First, growth for 2022, which the Chinese government had projected to be 5%, was 3%, one of the lowest in decades. And with 2023 set to see a global economic downturn, the pressures for low growth could continue. And China, the world's largest exporter, with exports accounting for around 20% of its economy, depends on the world to be able to grow at the same levels it has had in recent decades. But high inflation in 2022 that could continue in 2023, and an increase in interest rates almost everywhere in the world that make credit more expensive, has caused people to reduce their consumption, and China, as the factory of the world, could see a decrease in sales, as reflected in the 9.9% drop in exports in December 2022 compared to December 2021, marked mainly by a 26% drop in exports to the United States. And it has also been reflected in consumer confidence, which is at its lowest levels in recent decades. In addition, China's manufacturing PMI registered a value of 49 in December, falling below 50 for the 5th consecutive month, indicating a contraction in manufacturing activity. On the other hand, the measures imposed by the Chinese government and the war in Ukraine have made companies much more aware of the infinite possibilities that can cause interruptions in their production chains, which after decades of investment became excessively dependent on China, and this has generated a movement known as China Plus One, with which companies seek to diversify their production chains and not depend on a single country. It is not the closure of the production plants in China, but a reduction in future investments, which Apple, Hewlett-Packard, Dell, Samsung, Google, among others have begun to focus on India, Mexico, and Vietnam for their production. In fact, according to McKinsey Global Institute, American companies invested more in production in Mexico than in China in 2022. And not only foreign companies are making this decision, companies from China are also investing abroad to produce, especially considering that cheap labor, so attractive for manufacturing, has been disappearing in the country, and a worker can earn $1,400 a month, around 2 to 3 times the average income of the places where that production is going. And although the infrastructure and productivity is not the same, it is a gap that with time and investment can disappear. For its part, the government faces an increase in its budget deficit that reached a record $1.1 trillion from January to November 2022, caused by a decrease in taxes, tax incentives to stimulate the economy, and less commercial activity that generated a lower collection of taxes related to sales. And from the other side, it has also been affected by the increase in health spending. During the pandemic, due to all the checkpoints, the countless tests, and all the other measures taken by the government. And now to attend the contagion peaks caused by the reopening. And at the local level, governments have also seen their income decrease as a result of the country's real estate crisis, since a large part of their income comes from the leasing of land for the development of real estate projects, which now that they have decreased, have left a hole in the public finances of local governments. On the other hand, in the medium and long term, China faces a serious demographic problem that will force them to raise the pension age in the coming years. In China, men retire at 60 and women at 55 if they have a white-collar job, or 50 if they have a blue-collar job, which means that at the moment close to a third of the population is retired or close to retiring. And the dependency ratio, which looks at the relationship between people of working age and people who do not work, either because they are retired or are still very young, has been increasing in recent years, hand in hand with a slowdown in economic growth. This also puts extra pressure on government finances, because as the population pyramid continues to invert, there will be less collection of taxes and more spending on pensions. All these pressures on the government's finances have caused the debt to rise to 76% of its economy, with projections by the International Monetary Fund that the government will end 2027 with a debt of more than 100%, while private debt already reached 220%, according to the Bank of International Settlements. All of this has rightly caused the Chinese government to react and seek to recover the line of growth it had. But now it will have 4 major obstacles to achieve it, and with the possibility that a fifth appears at any moment, such as its debt levels. The first is the trade war with the United States, which will hurt growth in both economies for years to come, if nothing extraordinary happens, and even if it does, some of the damage with China Plus One has already been done. The second is the decrease in its population, which according to Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences will be around 1.1% for the next years, which, considering the rapid change for bad that comes with Chinese population figures, could actually be worse. And it was recently revealed that in 2022 China's population already presented a decrease, many years earlier than expected. The third is the change in the international arena that makes this decade projected to be of little economic growth for the world, including the possibility that we are heading towards deglobalization, and China, so integrated into international trade, will be more vulnerable if this or part of this materializes. And the fourth is the real estate crisis, a sector which had been a great driver of growth for the country, but now it will probably be more subdued and less leveraged despite the end of the 3 red lines. If it manages to overcome them, it will be something that we will see in the next few years and not in the next few months, but the world economy generally receives China's change in position positively. But what can we expect with this reopening? First, there will be increased demand from China as its entire economy restarts. This could cause a greater demand for raw materials and especially for crude oil. The inflation of 2022, as high as it was diminished thanks to the lower demand by China for so many essential raw materials in production, and crude oil prices, for example, have increased $3 and $5 per barrel in its WTI and Brent references respectively in the last month. Chinese consumers have also accumulated a large amount of savings that they are surely eager to start spending after almost 3 years of pandemic, and although the culture is different, in the rest of the world the behavior after a year and a half was generally of overspending, so it's not impossible for a version of this to happen in China. And this greater demand for raw materials, as well as the increase in demand from Chinese consumers, could cause new inflation spikes around the world, which will be partially helped by an increase in production in China. But it is not clear for now which of the two forces will be greater and if the total effect will be deflationary due to the great production or inflationary because the increase in production does not compensate for the greater demand. But whether it causes inflation or not, China's reawakening will be positive for the world and for the international economy. Although some analysts expecting that the reopening will end inflation and even avoid a recession, perhaps being too optimistic. But if they are right, It would be a pleasant surprise for this 2023 to break with the unpleasant surprises of previous years. And what do you think will happen to inflation and the economy in the world now that the Chinese economy is reborn? I would like to know your opinion. See you next time.